always commented on the colourful robes worn by your choir and their beautiful singing. I would like to thank your vicar for conducting today's service and Phil's many friends present today, especially Judy and Alan Shields, Lorna and Wayne Short, and Rod Cohen. Flight Lieutenant Philip Gray. I first met Phil in July 1944 when, with 4 other crew sergeants, we formed a crew and started flying training on Wellingtons. Phil was the pilot and captain of our crew. On the 9th of December 1944, we were posted to 1651 Heavy Conversion Unit at RAF Bullfox Lodge, where our crew were joined by a sergeant engineer, making our crew 7 number, and we commenced training on the 24-engine line. Phil immediately referred to us as the Clueless Crew. February 1945, we completed our training on the line, and we were posted to Fleet 6 Squadron, Bomber Command, RAF Stratashore. We completed 16 bombing sorties over various areas of Germany, including taking part in one sortie of 1,050 aircraft to Essen. On landing from these sorties, Philip always said, "Lady Luck is close to us today." With the end of World War II, it saw our crew dropping troop supplies to the people of Holland, and we made 4 trips to Jugencourt in France, bringing 24 of our own men who had been prisoners of war back to England, making 96 in total. These trips were the best of our flying together, as we felt we were helping people who had suffered in different ways during World War II. In July 1945, we were posted to 622 Squadron Mildenhall, training for the Far East. The next month, the Japanese surrendered, and on the 3rd of August that year, it was the last time we flew as the Clueless Crew, when some of us were posted to different RAF stations. I have known Phil for over 69 years, and he was not only an excellent pilot, but also a wonderful friend. I am the last member of the Clueless Crew, but my wonderful memories of them will remain with me forever. We lived, served, and fought together as brothers. The Clueless Crew of 1944 to 45 were Philip Gray, pilot, Jerry Millick, navigator, Jack Horner, ballmaker, Abby Wilkinson, wireless operator, Frank Parker, engineer, Oliver Bondi Foster, mid-upper gunner, Clinton Booth, rear gunner. Rest in peace, Phil, with your 5 departed crew members, your mid-upper gunner, Blondie. Thank you very much.
Well done. And now we have some memories from Ian McDougall, chairman of the Canadian Air and Space Museum, followed by Len Fox and Bob Burke and Wayne Short. And I just invite you to come up in order without announcement.
Phil was an inspiration to many of his colleagues at the Canadian Air and Space Museum, and of course, hundreds, if not thousands, of visitors. His was always a gentle presence, but there was a tougher side as well, and it was this tough side which explained a lot about his belief in the museum. Phil flew some of the most dangerous missions in World War II. His survival, however, brought another mission, which was telling his story. This was far more than just a series of reminiscences. He fought to keep alive the role played by young men in a conflict that produced horrors that threatened to overwhelm both the bravery and the sacrifices. The role of Bomber Command has a context that few today properly credit. Our country asked our young men to play their part and to do so without question. But many of our contemporary historians after the war were less understanding in their interpretations of who did what for whom and why. The controversies around Bomber Harris and the specifics around individual tactics and missions displace the gratitude properly owing to an entire generation. Worse still, Phil witnessed the countrywide failure to keep the script of his life as part of our living memory. He returned to this country as a recognized hero and watched the lessons of his life experience wither. When the museum closed, a videographer actually said to him that she didn't know Canada had even fought in World War II. As I said, Phil had a tougher side. He gave the museum the service of his old age, and he wanted us to save the service of his youth. He expected the country would keep the history he had shared alive. His love of the museum came with an expectation of reciprocation. He expected the museum to help. When it closed, he saw the culmination of a trend that discounted too much that mattered to the nation's fabric. He expected all of us to fight, and he wanted to know that there was hope. We had a mission too, and he expected performance commensurate with his sacrifice and post-war effort to keep his history breathing. His life mattered. It still matters. We must never forget. We must make sure that nobody else does.
Just the camera. Oh, yeah, that's okay. Okay.
I've been asked to say a few words on behalf of the Lancaster FM 104 restoration team. I would like to start by conveying some thoughts from our project team leader, Andrew Waltz, who is overseas and regrets that he cannot be here in person. Phil Gray was always the best ambassador the museum and the Lancaster could have hoped for. He put the face to the project. He was always a soft-spoken gentleman, storyteller, and a calming influence on an organization and volunteers that were often high-spirited. He was modest in a way only those who have seen real-life challenges can be, and an inspiration to those who were spared of his wartime experiences. Everyone drawn to the museum and the Lancaster project found their way there for their own reasons, be that an interest in aircraft, history, to gain experience, or just an opportunity to do something interesting with their time. Phil's presence at the museum always served to provide a focus and reminder of the real value and purpose in what we were doing. He and people of his kind are what elevated the project from mere tinkering to a mission and a calling. And even though we no longer have him here to draw on people's better side, he will continue to serve in that role, hopefully without end. I would like to add some of my own thoughts. It would be difficult to understate the importance of Philip to the Lancaster project. He was our front man. Sitting at his desk with a stack of books, he was the first person that museum visitors encountered when approaching the lake. As I pounded and drilled bits of aluminum, I would see Philip fully engaged in conversation, and then, hopefully, whipping out his pen to sign a copy of his book. Ah, another sale. But Philip wasn't in it for the profits, for he generously donated proceeds to the museum. He was in the business of preserving memories, and And wasn't that what all of us restoring the Lank were doing? Philip was our direct connection with the Lancaster. Sure, we had the cold aluminum hulk to touch, but here was a man that had actually flown the machine in combat. Many visitors to the museum and our Lancaster would comment that they had a connection with the Lank, be it themselves or a relative who had been a crew member or were involved in building the Lank in Malton. This personal connection extended to our own team members, including myself, who had close family ties to Bomber Command. With Philip, we shared something important. I'd like to relate a memorable story about Philip. I was in the museum that day, but another member of our team, Bob Burke, tells the story much better. According to Bob, Andrew had been working for some time on a cooperative effort with Jeff from Ottawa, who was working on a replica Lancaster cockpit. That day, Jeff visited and brought in an authentic Lancaster steering yoke for us to see, as well as some reproduction yoke castings. The restoration crew was gathered around the big work table as Jeff brought in the items. There were oohs and ahs. Andrew knew that Philip just had to see these items. Our Lancaster had been stripped of its yoke years earlier, and it was a rare and sought-after piece for the restoration. Philip had been busy at his table on the other side of the Lancaster fuselage, unaware of what had just been unveiled to the restoration crew. Andrew went to get Philip and asked the crew to keep silent. Andrew just told Philip that he had something to show him and asked Philip to close his eyes as he was guided over to the work table. Philip was asked to still keep his eyes closed and extend his arms while Philip placed the Lancaster steering yoke in Philip's hands, then asked him to identify what he was holding. Philip may not have immediately recognized what he was holding from touch alone after so many years, but when he opened his eyes, he was truly surprised and smiled the biggest smile you could imagine. I'm sure it brought back memories. This was a special moment with Phil. And this photo has been captured, and it may be on the presentation, I'm not sure, or you can take a look at it on the website along with some other photos of Philip on a restored the pilot seat in the Lancaster, in our Lancaster, with the yoke. Now, just like call on Bob Burke to say a few words. Thank you.
I too knew Philip. I met Philip through the volunteer work at the Canadian Air and Space Museum when I worked on the Lancaster restoration crew. Philip was indeed a valued friend to all of us and a real comfort to have nearby. We have heard of Philip's connection with the project, and while I share many of those memories, my most valued memories of Philip are of a more personal nature. I thought of Philip in some way as a connection to my father. My father did not know Philip, but he, like Philip, was also a wartime Lancaster pilot. My father passed away over 35 years ago and spoke little of his wartime experiences. He was a sensitive man, and like Philip, he lost many good friends back in those dark days. My father also lost 2 of his own crew when he was shot down over enemy territory. He became a prisoner of war, but he managed to survive and return home. Now, as I said, my father told me little of his personal exploits from back then, so there was a big void in my understanding of what he had gone through. Philip, however, was willing and very capable of describing some of the daunting flight operations these men had to endure. Philip could tell what it was like without embellishing the truth. I spoke several times to Philip over the 7 or so years that I knew him, and often listened in on his conversations with others as he told his stories at the museum. The There is nothing quite like hearing about that time in history when it comes from someone who was actually there. Philip's writings and stories touched me in a personal way. I thank Philip for the time he gave me and his willingness to tell about his own exploits. Philip may not have realized it at the time, but his stories filled in some big gaps for me on my own father and what he might have had to go through. So thank you, Philip. Thank you for telling your stories. You are a special person to me.
These guys are a hard act to follow. It was purely by accident how we got to meet this extraordinary man. It all started with our interest in the Avro Lancaster and knowing that the one that was down at the lakefront had been dismantled and taken to the museum in Downsview. So my wife Lorna and I proceeded to find out more about it. When we arrived at the museum and went to the Lancaster where it was stored, there was a gentleman sitting at a table displaying books and literature. He asked us if he could help us with any questions we may have. As we talked, we realized the knowledge he had with the Lancaster was amazing, and then to discover that this man flew one of these planes in the Second World War and had written a book on him and his clueless crew and their life experiences during this time. We purchased one of his books, and on our way home, Lorna started to read it to us as we were driving home in the van. The more she read, the more involved we became. When we got home, we completely read the whole book. We were so involved in it. As we were so impressed, we went back to see Philip the very next weekend to tell him how much we enjoyed his great book. On the way over to see him, I mentioned to Lorna that it would be nice to have Philip out for Sunday dinner, but we were not sure if he would accept, and boy, were we wrong. He was so pleased to think that someone would ask, and we were so pleased that he said yes. The next Sunday, Philip drove out to our place in Oakville and arrived at 2 p.m. right on schedule. With a bouquet of flowers for Lorna and a bottle of wine to go with dinner. What did he eat? Which made us so happy to see him enjoy his meal in this way. Philip, knowing that I get up at 4 a.m. to go to work, decided at 11 p.m. that he should be leaving so I could go to bed. This became the start of our relationship with a new friend, Philip Gray. The next time Philip came out to dinner, we went down to his car with him when he was leaving to show him how to get back out to the main road to get onto the QEW. As Lorna and I stood and watched him go around the corner, I said, I think we should stay here for a few minutes. Sure enough, here comes Philip down our street and drove right past our driveway as if he was right on the right track. We watched for a few minutes more, but he found his way out. The next time we had him out for dinner, we told him we would come and pick him up and take him home. He sounded relieved. As we were coming into our street, Philip raised his finger, and said, that's where I went wrong. Last summer, 2012, we had the great pleasure to meet with Ivor Foster as mid-upper gunner from his crew. We took them down to the CNE air show, and they both got sunburned and were sore for a few days. As we still talked with Ivor a couple of times every week on Skype, we are always reminded about that sunburn. Over the past few years, our friendship grew so strong that Philip started referring to us as his family. And our family refer to him as family. We have had family barbecues, dinners, and outings together that Philip and our family have enjoyed so much. A couple of months ago, Philip had a bad fall in his home, and we realized he was getting worse, so we asked him to stay in bed until we could get over there. And when we did get there, we did not like to see him with the discomfort he was in. We told him he had two options. One was the hospital, or two, he was coming home with us until he could get back on his feet again. He chose the second option, which we were glad he did. After the second week with us, my wife and Nurse Lorna had him eating and exercising on a regular schedule. I will always remember coming home from work and Philip would be laying on the bed or sitting in the chair watching the BBC World News. When it was over, we would discuss the world's sad state of affairs. During the news, he would express his feelings by pointing his right index finger or by holding his hands in this manner, showing disgust or disbelief in what was being said. After having Philip with us for 4 weeks, the bond became very special to Philip and Lorna and myself. On Sunday, October the 13th, we took Philip up to Kim and Steve's for Thanksgiving dinner. And Steve took Philip out for a tour of his Rainbow Trout Farm, which covers over 200 acres of ponds and a hatchery, which Philip enjoyed so much. After dinner was over, he put his hand on my wife's hand and said this was the first time he had ever sat at a dinner table to have a meal with the whole family, and showed his emotions with a little cry. Philip, we will always cherish your wit and your keen state of mind. You were always kind, thoughtful, patient, and a very caring and understanding to Lorna, myself, and our children and grandchildren. You were always a good listener, genuine, one in a million person. Because of your friendship, we got to meet 3 very important people in your life. Ivor Foster, your mid-upper gunner, Alan and Judy, and your very close friends who have become very special people to us. Philip, you will always remain a very big part of our family, and you will always be with us in our hearts, and we thank you for being who you are. Philip, we will never forget you and all the good times we shared. You will be sadly missed by all of us. Love you, Lorna, Wade, and your extended family, and may God bless you. Thank you.
Thank you so much to each one of you for those wonderful tributes that highlighted both his life contributions and his character as a person. He'd be very appreciative of your positive memories. For the next few minutes, I invite us to look at his life from a spiritual perspective. I firmly believe that each one of us is made in the image of God, and that each person's life therefore reveals something about the Creator who made us. In the same way that each book reveals something of the author, each life reveals something of God. As a quiet, little, humble man, it would be very easy to underestimate Philip until you got to know him. I think that was a lot like God too. We underestimate God and the difference that makes. But if I had to choose just one quality that was exceptional, I'd have to say it was service. Philip, or Wee Phip, as he was known as a youngster, that was in order to distinguish him from his grandfather Philip, his father Philip, and his cousin Philip. and he was one to joyfully help in any way he could. He was very close to his Aunt Aggie and Uncle Tom, who operated a farm outside of Dundee, Scotland, where Philip was born. And he would spend all of his holidays helping to collect eggs from free-range hens. And when they were free-range, you never knew where they were going to lay their eggs. He'd help to thin the beets within the fields and catch rabbits for dinner, once bringing back a grand total of 7 rabbits for one meal. I hope they had family and guests over that time. He loved to serve above and beyond. When World War II broke out on September 3rd, 1939, he joined the civil service, volunteering with the Ministry of Food. 2 years later, he volunteered with the Royal Air Force. In late 1941, determined to become a pilot. At the end of basic training, you were either given a set of long johns and a warm hat, meaning you were coming to Canada, where there was going to be snow, or you were simply given a hat with this wedge cap with a prestigious white flash, meaning you were going to be sent to the United States. 90% of the Air Force people were trained here in Canada and 10% in the US. But his willingness to go anywhere and do whatever was needed was part of that sense of service beyond himself. Back in England in February 1945, now Flight Lieutenant Philip and his crew began their bombing missions over Germany. You need to know that the average lifespan of an air crew was 3 weeks and 4 flights. So to make 16 sorties, 16 missions, was an incredible accomplishment. At any one time, the fleet of 2,000 Lancaster bombers, half of them were in need of repair, riddled with bullet holes or missing parts of appendages. So it took a lot of courage to keep getting back up and flying again and again. You only do that when you're willing to be in service beyond yourself. Of course, he said that what kept him alive and what kept him going when there was no one else up there but you and your Maker, and he placed his faith and trust in that divine presence. As you heard from Ivor, the next 8 sorties when the war in Europe ended were picking up POWs from France and dropping food to people in the Netherlands, where food was so scarce that they had nothing to eat except tulip bulbs and roots of plants. So needless to say, it was a happy sight. And Philip felt their gratitude, and that was his most proud and gratifying act of service. At the end of the mission, they were being trained for Japan. But thankfully, the war completely ended, and most of them were released from active service. But Philip continued. In fact, 46 years of flying in total. He returned to Dundee, Scotland, but every single weekend he would be flying with the Air Force Reserve. And back in Scotland, he was still in the service industry, owning a retail shop along with his brother-in-law. He had actually trained at Patton's Business College before the war. And so he used those skills in an ever-changing retail business to trying to discern what the public were interested in buying and needing, the changing trends. When there was an invitation to be part of Fighter Command on the island of Sylt, with a 22-mile beach off the west coast of West Germany, for 18 months he again went into service and accepted this challenge. He said it was more dangerous than flying in the wartime. They were practicing air-to-air shooting, aiming at a banner that was being towed by an airplane, the lead plane. So the ones coming behind were supposed to do target practice on the banner. And he said that more pilots died on that beach in peacetime than died in World War II. I think he was relieved when that 18 months was over, but he stuck it out, wanting to be of service and equip and train those that were needed by the Air Force. Then, of course, he was willing to go anywhere, and New Zealand offered him jobs with the government there. 5 different positions, in fact: the Ministry of Labor, the Civil Aviation Division, the Department of Education, the Ministry of Transport, and finally, believe it or not, the New Zealand Wildlife Service. And in addition, he was writing community comment scripts for the National Radio Program of New Zealand. Service with such resourcefulness, so many different talents. When he came to Canada in 1990, he looked for ways again to contribute. It would be 10 years later, in 2000. Imagine just beginning to volunteer at age 78 and continuing that for 13 years, which with what began as the Toronto Air and Space Museum and is now called the Canadian Air and Space Museum. He volunteered 3 times a week, Wednesdays, Saturdays, and Sundays. He'd come to worship and he'd dart out the door at the end of it to go to the museum and volunteer. And I think if you would do anything in his honor, it might be for us to rally our own government and our own members of Parliament to ask for this precious piece of Canada's history to be preserved and fitted properly. I can hardly believe what has happened. It really is unbelievable and just so disheartening for Philip. If he's watching, I would hope that we might make him proud with any effort we can to restore. And his service didn't end there. He spoke at every Remembrance Day, I think probably for the month of November and before, in October, for school, public children, teaching them. I know he did with our church Sunday school here. He would tell his stories, as was said, without ever glorifying the war, knowing what needed to be done and how gruesome it was, how horrible, and yet how necessary. I don't know how he found time as well to volunteer 7 hours a week for Travelers Aid at the Toronto International Pearson Airport, but he was conscious of people coming from another country and feeling a little bit adrift in a new place. And so here was someone who had traveled the world and knew how they felt, there to welcome and orientate them. He got involved with Spires, the weekly magazine with Betty Coulter, for 5 years, helping to publish that. And then got involved in church news. He wanted people to know what churches of every denomination through Etobicoke were doing. And he would be the editor and handling the contributions and encouraging, the service we offered that are always free to be taken advantage of for people. finally, of course, was his own life, his advice, if you will, in closing, that said, if you want to do something, don't mess around and waste time. Think higher and go for it. A man of service who just simply saw what was needed and rolled up his sleeves and went into action. Imagine if God is like that, delighting in every opportunity to be a mentor, to serve, to support us, always willing to help in a time of need, incredibly resourceful and dependable, someone you can count on to be there, true to their word, ready to travel over hill and vale and go the extra mile. Philip showed us a God who is very present in a time of trouble and a magnificent friend on whom we can depend. Philip said that at 20,000 feet, it was God who must have a purpose and a plan for his life. It was faith in God that gave him the strength to keep on going and to stop him from going around the bend. Philip was a shepherd, like the 23rd Psalm. He himself was a good shepherd, and he experienced the love of God as his own. So thank you, God, for the gift of Philip Gray, and thank you, Philip, for showing us God in action. At this point, Ivor Foster, who we heard through Skype, shared this RAF hymn, sort of words to the tune of Eternal Father, Strong to Save. And you'll be invited to turn in your bulletin and sing 3 verses of it. And we'll stand for this.